We will now begin Yomiuri International Forum 2020 Autumn Session, Trump, Biden, and Japan's Security Strategy. I have the honor of serving as the moderator. I'm Saki Oji, Senior Research Fellow of Yomiuri Research Institute. Continuing from the spring session in May, this is part of the Yomiuri International Forum 2020 series with an overarching theme of restoring international order with innovation. Like the last time, this is live cast online. Through simultaneous interpretation, the session in English is live cast on the Japan News website. If you would like to listen in English, please visit that website. The quadrennial U.S. presidential election is fast approaching. It will take place on November the 3rd. President Trump is seeking re-election, but he was infected with the coronavirus. And minute by minute, there are dramatic developments. Who will win between the Republican Mr. Trump and the Democratic nominee Mr. Joe Biden? Now, in Japan, Suga administration started on September 16. We now have a new prime minister for the first time in 7 years and 9 months. Under the new prime minister, how will the new U.S.-Japan relations take shape? And as China grows in economic capabilities, militarily, technologically, how will things develop in terms of struggle for hegemony between the United States and China, and Japanese national security and economic security for Japan? We have 3 eminent speakers who are experts on these issues as panelists. Seated next to me is Mr. Nobukatsu Kanehara, who is a special guest professor of Doshisha University and a foremost authority on international law when he was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he was the first Deputy Secretary General of National Security Council. And we have Mr. Yoshimasa Hayashi, member of the House of Councillors, top policy expert on foreign affairs and security in LDP, and former Minister of Defense and Minister of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. And Mr. Tsuneo Watanabe, Senior Research Fellow, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, who specializes in the research of U.S.-Japan relations and Asia security. I would like to ask each speaker to give an initial remark for about 10 minutes, and at the remaining time, we would like to discuss the desirable U.S.-Japan relations between Prime Minister Suga and whoever becomes the next president of the United States, struggle for hegemony between China and the United States, Japanese economic security, and East Asian security environment. And lastly, I would like to ask each of the 3 panelists to predict the winner of the U.S. presidential election. We plan to end at 2:30 p.m. First, I would like to ask Mr. Hayashi to discuss mainly on the U.S.-Japan relations and China-Japan relations. And I would like to ask Mr. Watanabe to give the analysis of the current status of the presidential election in the United States and to speak about Chinese trend by Mr. Kanehara.
Thank you. And it is a great honor to be invited to this splendid forum, and I would like to express my appreciation. So with Mr. Kanehara and Mr. Watanabe, we meet often to discuss the different issues. So all 3 of us may be saying the same thing as a consequence, but I hope that we can avoid that today. But let me start the speech as the first at the bat. Now, if you know your own capability, then you will be able to be not afraid of being beaten by any war or battle. There are many in Japanese who are looking at the United States situation there, and there are many analyses being given, and many people say many different things. But since the presidential election is ongoing, I would like to also speak about Trump and Biden as the focus of attention. 2 years ago, there has been a midterm election, and on that occasion, the Republican Party, what we have known in the past, at least within the federal government and even in the state governments, have actually undergone a transformation in many ways. In the midterm election, of course, in the actual election, Republicans and Democrats will be fighting with each other. But before that, in the United States, there are primary before that. And for example, Mr. Ryan is said to be the central the person for the next generation to have actually stepped down. And during the primary, what was said to be of a traditional Republican policy being asserted, but have changed its position, and the Trump-like statements that had to be made or to be beaten by someone much closer to the Trump. So there has been a big change in the nature of the Republican the members. Those who are much closer to Trump have been chosen and elected during the midterm elections. So that was a big the aspect. And on the other hand, for Vice President Biden, within the Democratic Party was said to be the middle of the road the person. So these two candidates are trying to vie with each other. So free trade and closer to business, that was Republican. And protectionism and labor union were the tenets for the Democrats in the past. But right now it is much different. Mr. Trump has as a core supporter the white the workers. So how can he be able to make appeal to his core constituency? On the other hand, Vice President Biden will look at middle of the road and high-tech the businesses. That is how the Democrats have changed from the Obama administration, and diversity seems to be the norm these days for the Democrats. Now, when I and others 2 decades or so ago being studying in the United States, the Republican Party was said to have a much bloated situation. So in the United States, only the registered voters can vote. So it is not that 60% of the population are actually casting votes, but only 60% of the registered voters are casting their votes. So when the voting ratio is 60%, it is exactly as such. So registration for the election would be more higher income, and those who are interested in politics would be registered and casting their votes. So perhaps there has been bias for the Republicans. So that is the reason why it is said that constituency for the Republicans was much bloated. Now, there are now massive a quantity of the people who wanted to directly support Mr. Trump 4 years ago are now being registered. So that is a big change for the Republican Party. When I look back at the first term for President Trump, it was easy to understand. He wanted to get re-elected. So what would be advantageous for him in order to be re-elected? But then after being re-elected, when and if Mr. Trump wins in the election, then what would be the line of policy going forward? And what should be the basis for our prediction? That is not clear at all. On the other hand, Vice President Biden, he has been a member of the Congress for 30 years or so, and he has been the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So he is more orthodox style in terms of foreign policy. And because he has been in the Congress for many, many decades, he has very close colleagues, those who are in the leadership position, and they would perhaps come into his cabinet. So this may be a little bit different from how Mr. Trump has been creating his own cabinet, the cronies and so forth. Now, what about the TPP and multilateralism? And what about Japan and U.S. and Japan or U.S.-China relationship? Would it be on a bilateralism or would it be on a multilateralism? Trump and Biden would also be very different. And what about the domestic issues? President Trump would be geared towards the fossil fuels. On the other hand, Vice President Biden will be looking more for renewables. So there is a difference there as well. So whoever may be elected, there will be difference in policies to be put forward. And we need to be clearly aware of that in trying to respond to those possible changes. Now, on the side of Japan, it's been 1 month since the Suga administration has been born, and it is quite smooth sailing so far. And we want the cabinet ministers to be given mandate and to work hard. That seems to be the style of Suga government. So for the foreign policy, Minister Motegi, the foreign minister, is given the latitude to properly deal with the diplomatic issues. So I hope that the two governments will be able to deal with each other in a friendly manner, and we would like to support him. Now, what about China? Who would be better for China is often discussed, Trump or Biden. Which would be better for China? And I feel that China may think that Trump may be easy to be dealt with. And the grounds for saying this is, so it is deal-making. The national security and trade are being put on the same table, and everything is a deal, making deal. That is the Trump style. But then Mr. Biden, on the other hand, because he is a Democrat, he is emphasizing more of values and principles like the human rights issue and so forth. And in addition to that, he has been interested and has been active in the foreign policy arena as the member of the Congress. So even though he may be shaking hands, he had maybe been putting forward policy and statements that is not to be welcomed by China. So when Vice President Biden is being elected, he may not be as close to China as before under the Democratic government. Or even if Mr. Trump is reelected, it may not be that he will be fighting forever over China. Now, we have done our work and have strived hard to establish the CPTPP, but then there was no United States included. Now, under Mr. Biden, anything but is often said when the ruling party changes for the administration. So when Bush said ABC, anything but Clinton, that seems to be the norm these days. So some people say that Mr. Biden may try to turn over everything what Mr. Trump has done. So with the TPP, the initial objective was to bring forth rules, not just the tariff levels, but with the trade agreement and a zone created. If you are included, then you will be able to benefit from the rules and tariffs as well. Now, the intellectual property as well as state-owned enterprises, which are being questioned these days, they are inconsistency in terms of rules under the TPP or the CPTPP. So we already have the rules being established between Japan and US, and the Trade Promotion Authority, the TPA, is not being given to the administration yet from the Congress. There are many hurdles to be overcome, including the trade union status. But when Mr. Biden becomes the president, TPP may once again the focus of attention. So for now, that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hayashi. 2 years ago, you pointed out that the Republican Party changed in its nature, and for China, it is often said that it's loose, be it Trump or Biden, but you've pointed out that China might feel that Trump might be an easier counterpart to deal with. Thank you for sharing your views. And regarding TPP and its outlook, we would like to have more in-depth discussion later. Now, Mr. Watanabe, please. Thank you very much. With the two eminent speakers with whom I enjoy close exchange of ideas quite regularly. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be a panelist with the two colleagues. As for the presidential election, it was the case 4 years ago, and it's true today. The U.S. presidential election is the focus of attention as never before. The outcome of the U.S. election, of course, affects the world, and that is true for this year, but there are bifurcation, and this may lead to decline of the force of appeal of the United States. As Mr. Hayashi mentioned, which is more attractive for China, divided the United States or united United States, it depends on which is favored. And when we look at the U.S. election, the country is divided. Just a couple of hours ago, what is symbolic of that division in the United States took place. President Trump and former Vice President Biden held competing town hall meetings at the same time on different broadcaster. I think some of you have watched that debate. It's very difficult. I have to switch back and forth between the two different channels, and it made me crazy. And that is how divided the situation is. A friend of mine who is a journalist in the United States, and I spoke with a friend this morning. It is as if there are parallel worlds between Republicans and Democrats. The recognition is different, perception is different. They are living in totally different worlds. There are two parallel worlds. My friend is reporting from Pennsylvania, and there are parallel worlds in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is one of the states that is very closely contested. Now, what can we do given this situation? In this upcoming presidential election, after the election, will there be efforts to unite and overcome this parallel world situation? But what we were able to find out is that, as we can see in the fact that competing town hall meetings were held, there is no such intention on the part of the president. But it seems that Mr. Biden is more willing, setting aside whether he's able to do that. According to the poll, Mr. Biden has an edge, but he doesn't have an absolute lead. We still have more than 2 weeks before the election. For one thing, if Mr. Trump was an ordinary president, it is easier to predict. But there are added uncertainties of COVID-19 and mail-in ballots, and Mr. Trump may not accept a defeat. Peaceful transition, whether he will accept a peaceful transition, he did not answer yes clearly. He said he has to watch carefully. There may be fraud. So to put my conclusion first, either case, divided state will continue. There are different ways of winning and losing, but seeing this situation as an outsider, I hope that the result of the presidential election will leave less scars than it would otherwise be the case. Looking at the poll data, this is general data. Very clear politics is the average of various polls in the United States, and generally speaking, 51.5% is Mr. Biden's support, and 42.3% is Mr. Trump's support. This is across the United States. And if a U.S. presidential election is the addition of the popular vote nationwide, then this poll result may suggest that Mr. Biden has an edge. But in the United States, in the presidential election, electoral college system is used, where in each state, in each district, the winning candidate will have the vote of all of the electoral college. 4 years ago, between Trump and Clinton, there were similar differences. And in popular vote, Clinton won 2.8 million more votes, but the end result was President Trump winning. So we have to observe the closely contested states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Traditionally democratic state, but they are also conservative voter base, and they are always swing states. And in case of Pennsylvania, according to Real Clear Politics, 43.8% for Trump and more than 50% for Biden. It's 8.9 point different. And that's not a wide difference. Biden 50.8%, Trump 43.8%. This may be within the statistical era. There are also hidden Trump supporters. They don't vocally say that they are supporting Trump, but actually support Trump. This phenomenon is also pointed out. And it may certainly be true that there are these closet Trump supporters, but they may be exaggerated. But why this becomes important in the statistics is that there are voters who are undecided until right before the election, and those numbers are not reflected in the poll. It's said that about 10% are not decided yet amongst the voters. And until the end, in these closely contested states, I think we will not know who the winner is, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And there is another factor this time, that is that the number of swing states has increased. Florida is always an important swing state, and the state of Ohio as well. But we now see Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. When we think back some time ago, these are traditionally red states, the Republican states. But now these can be a swing state. In case of Arizona, Biden support is 48.5% and 45.5% for Trump, a 3-point lead for Biden. And what this tells us is that not that Mr. Biden is becoming more popular or Mr. Trump is not popular. Structurally speaking, it seems that in the states that were traditionally red states, also had an inflow of Democratic supporters. What's easy to understand is Texas and Arizona. These are facing border with Mexico, and Hispanics are increasing. And there are also people who moved from California in quite a large number. And the same applies for Georgia and North Carolina, from Boston and from northern states where there are more Democratic supporters, high-tech companies, and together with the high-tech companies, employees of high-tech companies have migrated to these states. Structurally, it seems that the Democratic Party has an advantage. As Mr. Hayashi said, the advantage of the Republican Party is gradually being eroded. That is the current status. So in comparison to 4 years ago, it seems that, relatively speaking, Mr. Trump is somewhat at a disadvantage. And so, in a nutshell, how can we characterize this U.S. presidential election this time? I will not hesitate to say it's COVID-19 election. Mr. Trump's scenario was upended because of COVID-19. If we are to find his achievement, he achieved economic growth. That is very clear. And before COVID-19, Trump's support was based on economy, but because of COVID-19, there is a downturn in economy. And the trend is that when economy is booming, incumbent wins, and when economy is recessionary, like Carter and Bush Sr. in 1992, the incumbent loses. And so COVID upended the scenario for Mr. Trump. And the other factor is Black Lives Matter movement. And when the movement spread, Mr. Trump said law and order. I think this can be one strategy, but white supremacists, Mr. Trump did not clearly criticize the white supremacists. And in the first presidential debate, there is a white supremacist organization, Proud Boys, and Mr. Trump said, "Stand back and stand by." it can be understood in many different ways, but Mr. Trump, if he is not satisfied with the outcome of the presidential election, he may pressurize these organizations and may instigate these organizations to take certain undesirable actions. And there are many mail-in ballots. Because of COVID-19, there are more mail-in ballots this time. And more Democratic voters are voting by mail, it is said. And we cannot know for sure, but what is generally being said is that Mr. Trump may declare victory on the day of the presidential vote before all of the mail-in ballots are counted. And Democrats will go to the court, and it may be like 2000. Then we will not know the outcome. It may be more advantageous for incumbent. But for district court, in the federal court, many judges were named by President Trump, and currently the nomination for Supreme Court justice is deliberated and fought over in the Congress right now. So after such turbulent election, the divided state of the United States will not be healed no matter who becomes the winner. As an ally of the United States and as an important friend of the United States, we are concerned. We hope that the United States will regain its strength and heal the wound of the division. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watanabe. This is the COVID-19 election. There are many uncertainties. Whoever may win, be it Trump or Biden, division may continue in the U.S. society. That was your point. So, Mr. Kanehara, please. Thank you very much for the invitation. What I would like to point out is, in the presidential election, who may win? That is a big question. But going beyond that, whoever may win, for Japan, United States is an absolute must. Geopolitical megatrends, when we look and observe those trends, the big change is the rise of China. So what is relevant of that? Industrialization that happened in the Great Britain at the end of 18th century and Japan outside of the West had been able to grow as an industrialized state. And the Ottoman Turkey and Mughal Empire, or the Qin dynasty in the China, of course, they were so capable in terms of fighting, but the strength have been changed. So the map has been changed. There has been big change in megatrends, and only about 18 countries or so for industrialization. And Germany has been beaten twice, and Japan has also lost the war once. And there has been the second group, which is also very strong, and that is a global-wide industrialization. The last heavyweight latecomers are China and India, and of course the African continent to follow. The average age for them is 39 years old, and Japan is 10 years older or even more. And on African continent, it's 19, and India, it is only 29. And they have 1 billion in African continent. And if you go from the Orient to the Occident, India, about 1/3 is suffering from going without electricity. So 1980s, the China is the India today. China has already taken off. And with the demographic bonus is over for China, and aging is progressing. So no more two-digit growth. They're saying 6.8%. That is a lie. But still, I believe there is actually 3% growth. So how to respond to China? This is something we cannot run away with. And 10 years ago, the China equaled the Japan in strength. And 20 years ago, it was much cuter and more charming. It was like a panda. But in just 10 years or 20 years, they have overtaken us. And I don't think there is no other country who will be able to be on par with China. China is becoming the more irritated. During the global financial crisis, they had the fiscal stimulus, and it was China who led the whole world, the G20 process. After the petroleum shock, Germany and Japan were called upon, and we joined the G7. And that happened to China, the same thing in 2008. But then the atmosphere has changed. We had the Koizumi government, and we have been criticized and bashed. And we were grumbling to the United States. But America was like bye-bye Japan and hello to China. So the atmosphere has changed. But I was always discussing with my friends at Pentagon that this is wrong. Now, how to respond to China going forward? China was persevering for many, many years. But now they're speaking their own minds. They don't want to belong to the West. If it becomes stronger, then they would come up with their own world. The Xi Jinping administration has a stronger preference for having their own world and community to be created. So China will not change, and how can we deal with China going forward? There are three major things that we need to take note of. One thing is, when Japan has been the upcoming the country, that we have been beaten then, there has been the big change ever since then. Colonialism that was still rampant, and authoritarianism that was there. But we were looking at resources to be taken away, but we have made a big failure. But then colonialism is gone, and racial discrimination is gone. So in a liberal international order is now being built, but more recently, the communist the world has collapsed. And the dictatorship that has been ended in Asia. There are many democracies starting up, and Japan thought that this is great, and this is what we have always wished and hoped for. But we have to tell China that China is very different. China is based upon Confucianism, that they they have the dichotomy in the world. It is not a flat world that we want and we have created. And what about free trade? During the Abe government, we have for the first time created TPP 11, the CPTPP, and Japan EU EPA, the mega the trade the zone. And now Japan and EU and other the CPTPP, if you add United States, we would be more than half of the world GDP. For China, it is only in their teens. And now that we have created this great trade zone is something very good. But this is true free trade. We look at vertically as well as diagonally. Everything is being connected with each other. So there is a free flow of people, the goods as well as the finance. But if you look at China, the One Belt, the One Road, it is more like a star shape, trying to have the hub at the center and trying to have reaching out in a star shape. This is exactly like Russia, but this is a great competition. So we need to be very mindful of trying to be stronger in having the liberalism to prevail. It is now about 100 yen to a dollar, but we cannot really rely upon export. But those who have invested abroad are still very strong, and the values being created there would be the income for that host country. Even though we say that we have hollowing out, actually the Japanese businesses are creating a lot of money and a lot of income, and they are being recreated. Then international capitalism and market economy must function well. If not, Japan cannot survive, because from export-oriented, we are now more investment-oriented nation. The last point is, we are human beings, that the weak cannot be heard. So the power relationship and power politics is something we need to be mindful of. But engagement can work. Japan, EU, United States, and India, it will be more than half of the world GDP. China has a military expenditure which is 4 times that of Japan, but for United States it's already still 16 times. So I don't think China will be able to catch up. So China cannot become a world hegemon, but it would be able to become a regional hegemon. Before becoming a global hegemon, it may peak out. So we need to create a sense of security and have a trust-building exercise. But the precondition would be solidarity of the West. If we are on one-on-one basis, we can never win. So the U.S. leader must be able to bring all the democracies together and hope to listen to Japan as well. Now, the next presidential election would be very important because of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kanehara. We will now have discussion. Topic one is the outlook of Japanese diplomacy under the Suga administration. On this topic, please speak based on the order of Mr. Kanehara, Mr. Watanabe, and Mr. Hayashi. But afterwards, please indicate that you wish to speak by a hand gesture or eye contact. Mr. Kanehara, Mr. Hayashi said that Suga administration had a good start. Now it is 1 month after its inception, and Foreign Minister Motegi is expected to play his role successfully. And Mr. Kanehara, in your remarks, you've said that China considers China to be at the center. One Belt, One Road is also positioning China at the center. Japan also has to have stable relations with China, but for that, it requires the unity of the Western world. But Trump is fighting with his NATO friends and Western country allies. What is the desired international order for Japan and foreign policy vis-a-vis China and U.S.-Japan relations? What are the specifics in these policies that are desired from Suga administration? Thank you for that question. Suga administration is still LDP administration, the same as Mr. Abe's administration, so it will not be anything but. Abe diplomacy was rather successful, so I'm sure that Prime Minister Suga will continue with the policy. Mr. Trump had very good relations with Japan. I think there's some sense of being fed up with Merkel and others, but there was a good relations with Japan, and U.S.-Japan relations was stable. And America first was not received very well in NATO, but West should be united because of China. Recently, that has been advocated by the U.S., for example, in the speech by Mr. Pompeo in March. Then that should be followed with actual efforts to unite the Western world. But I think there is some indication of that direction, so I hope the U.S. will move in that direction. Now, as for Japan, he visited ASEAN immediately after becoming prime minister. Indonesia has a 300 million population, and Myanmar, Thai, Malaysia, Vietnam follow in population size, and there is also Singapore, which is quite clever. And with all of the ASEAN countries, one by one, there should be good dialogue. And otherwise, they will say you are overlooking or ignoring. And under Abe administration, before Abe administration, there was no visit from Japanese leader for 10-year hiatus, and he was welcomed back in somewhat ironical way when he first made the visit. And the size of the country is the same as the United States, with a population of 23 million, which is Australia. And the next rising superpower, India. Australia, although with a small population, it has military, and there is India, and Japan, US, Australia, India was advocated by the first Abe administration. At that time, why was the reaction from Australia and India? The US was happy, but about having US in Japan, but Australia said, why India? And India said, why Australia? But because of the rise of India as well, it is more accepted these days. And as for Europe, the United Kingdom and France are facing oceans and they have navy. And Germany has also changed its thinking. I think this is important. Germany is a member of the NATO, and opposite from Japan, it can only exercise collective defense. Once NATO makes decision, it can join in the action, but it cannot take a single action. There is strong resistance from the parliament. So it was quite invisible in NATO. And China is 100% economy. It was perceived as only interested in economy, but starting this year in the Asia-Pacific framework, Germany has started to say that it should regard things strategically. After Brexit, the center of Europe will shift to Germany and France. So these countries are important. And now Russia, even with territorial issues, through negotiation, we would like to improve environment. And that was started under Mr. Abe. And I think there is a support from the people of Japan on that point. So relations should be improved. And with that, we will be able to have more stable relations with China. And with the stability, there will be greater trust. And with greater trust, it's possible to coordinate interests. Even during the Cold War, there was a minimum level of trust between the United States and Soviet Union, and it was possible to negotiate denuclearization. So we need at least that level of stability and trust. Now, as for TPP, when I speak to American friends, TPP is economically important, but there's not likelihood of reviving for the United States. And even a democratic government, because it considers a working class important, it may not have a chance, but I hope the U.S. will consider TPP more seriously.
Then, if I may continue, under the Suga administration, what we expect and hope for to happen is exactly what we were hoping for to Prime Minister Abe's government and all the other governments as well. We want to have long-living administration. To just quit after 1 year, that is not good at all. In the first term of Abe administration and Aso, or Fukuda administration, then Aso administration, and 3 administrations under Democratic Party of Japan, there has been change so frequently. So what we were hoping for is, unless you are long-living administration, you cannot do anything at all. So for the foreign policy and the national security issues have been resolved in many ways under the second term of Abe administration. You have to have another election by next autumn for Suga government, but unless you are long-lived, you cannot really come up with proper policy, including the free and open Indo-Pacific, which has been started under Prime Minister Abe, or even for your own defense, the so-called peace and security legislation. What has been prepared cannot be put into force. So all the different issues have been legislated and tried to be solved by law, but that not actually implemented. Implementation is not yet done, although the preparation has been made. So the Suga governments should do that. Now, after the Abe government, you have to be long-lived in order to implement your policies. I hope that that should be the attitude of Suga administration as well. What Mr. Kanehara has said just now, the solidarity of the Western countries. Now, whether Japan is included in the West, and what about the other Asian countries? Everyone is included in the West, definition-wise. The liberty and democratic values are being the tenets and values and principles being upheld. Then free and open Indo-Pacific should be the concept. And Europe as well as Canada are also included, and also ROK is included. So everything is inclusive, so to speak. It is open and everyone is welcome to create such a concept. That is the position of Japan, but Japan alone cannot do it. So we need the more friends and colleagues, and you have to have the power and strength to vamp up your position. So that is the reason why Japan-US alliance is the cornerstone. The Quad is Japan, US, Australia, and India. At last, we had the Quad Foreign Ministers Conference in Japan. And from the earliest time, Quad plus the American, the think tank, Indian think tank, and Australian think tank, and Japanese think tanks got together to propose for that. Japan and US are quite serious. But what about India and Australia? They individually would be happy to work with Japan and US, but if it is 4 countries, they cannot really do that. But it was China who has become the glue for the 4 countries, because China now has skirmishes with India alongside the border. There are casualties as well. And because of COVID-19, Australia, because of looking at the pathway, for the infection inside China, they wanted to have clear explanation, directly or indirectly. Now tariffs are being imposed as a retaliation from China. So now Australia is in battle with China. So China is a glue for the Quad countries. And I'm asking Prime Minister Suga that this is a good chance and opportunity. So we need to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. In my initial remarks, as I mentioned, each minister should be given clear instruction with a deadline from Prime Minister Suga, and that is indeed the way of doing things under Suga administration. So basically, Foreign Minister Motegi and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense centrally will be pursuing these policies in Japan. On a day-to-day basis, diplomacy and a major direction, the foreign policy should be combined in good way. In foreign policy, the major direction should be indicated from the Prime Minister. And as 2 other panelists mentioned, that is the continuation with the Abe diplomacy. I think that is the major direction. In that sense, FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, this is one. And Kanehara-san said the West, but the West, the East, and the South can all come under the umbrella of FOIP. With a large computer and with the internet, we have to compete. That is the picture I have. And geographic distance should not translate into psychological distance, but that is often the case. Some time ago, I had an exchange with parliamentarians from EU, and their future, in terms of future vision, their perception of Russia and our perception of China, it seemed were like mirrors. For Europe, even today, Russia is a security threat, partly due to Ukraine situation, and it's similar to China for Japan. But for EU, China is somewhat far away, and it's considered as a major market. And for Russia, although there is an issue of northern territories, but when it comes to day-to-day diplomacy, Russia is not necessarily at the forefront of our awareness. It's on the edge, both edges of the Eurasia for Japan and EU. So things are perceived differently because of this geographical distance. But it's important to have a sharing of these perceptions between Japan and Europe. In case of South and North, it's the same applies to Australia and New Zealand. And as the other panelists spoke, because of China acting as a glue, we may become more united. And sometimes we are frustrated. Why do not see the same picture? But that leads to not a fruitful discussion. So we should try to establish a major common direction.
Now, about China, we have heard your comments, but if you could once again talk about the US-China competition, the so-called hegemony competition. be it in the cyber as well as the high-tech area. It has been expanding. So why has the relationship between the two countries deteriorated so much? As Mr. Kanehara has said, in terms of national security, it may be true that Japan is much closer to the United States. There is no other option. But what about the economic security, where the government is putting more full-fledged focus? So in terms of economic security, maybe we need to be more considerate to China. So for Japan, economic security, because of the U.S. the China the conflict, we are sandwiched in between. But could you discuss more about the U.S.-China competition ongoing, Mr. Kanehara? After I have moved out from NSC, I am now in an economic team. So let me try to make a PR stunt. Economy and security were not combined with each other. That was only in Japan. It is not that there are two worlds. There is only one world. So economy is closely related to the security matters. Now about the European Union, then you have the common community on coal and steel, meaning that they wanted to prevent any war anymore with Germany. So the economy and security are one and the same. We were told that the economy should be boosted, but security-wise, we are strictly controlled by the United States. But for security, we are quite restricted. But on economy, we could go and go because we have lost in the war. But the U.S., they're always thinking at the same level of economy and security. 80 trillion the yen for the DoD in the United States. From the total, the budget is 1% of the world's GNP is being spent by the DoD. It is said the 80 trillion yen and the 1 trillion yen only for the semiconductors, and that is not sufficient enough at all. The security and the economy are the two sides of the same coin. So we should not think in terms of separate worlds. And now there is an excessive reaction. When we talk about the decoupling, China, people may think that China may become another USSR, that all the machinery would be stopped and all the economic and trade and be stopped. That is not true. Security is more sensitive. Toys R Us, anybody can create toys and so forth. But if you are beaten in the war, that should be stopped. What about the fighting the war today? Unless you are aware of that, you cannot really have economic security. When we speak of war during the August, Pacific War comes into mind. That would never happen anymore. The soldiers today have just a joystick and one screen. It is something like the fighting a game battle. That is the warfare today. So what is happening is all the sensors would give you all sorts of information and data, and you have artificial intelligence. The presence of enemy is known instantly. So where can we deliver our weapons? That could be known instantly and most efficient. Fighting the battle, you can press the button and everything would end. And that is true also for China and every other country. Japan alone is lagging behind. It is sensors and computing, artificial intelligence, and semiconductors and sensors. Those are the type of warfare. And the high technology like fintech, mobility, the genome editing, and a little bit different, this hyper supersonic, and also the quantum computing. When quantum comes in to the picture, everything that would have to be different. IPR, everything would be changed. So it is something like the paper at the other edge, where you have the Chinese students not making thefts, but the other way would be the semiconductor. Japan is no longer producing those chips. We have given away to China, ROK, and Taiwan. So the semiconductors are being produced by just those three countries. So, but we are designing to have the cutting-edge semiconductors and also fabrication machines. We all still have those industry in Japan. And there are 3 types of simulations. One is the platform. That is also important, like Rakuten and Yahoo's domain. And China would exclude everybody else. So it is already decoupled. GAFA cannot make money because they are not invited into China at all. And China, on the other hand, is coming into China and the United States making inroads like TikTok. This is for children, so why is it dangerous? But intelligence today, it is not looking for critical information, trying to take away every type of information. You have artificial intelligence, and you will be able to have a big data analysis, and you can siphon up the important technology and information from there. So the birth dates, as well as credit card numbers of your children, they will be stolen away. Everything will be stolen away right by China. And how may be utilized is not known. So the WeChat, no, you should not use it. No TikTok. And this is for the platform. What about the network? This is 5G as well as undersea cable, the marine the cable. In the past, it was the interception by physically coming in by night and try to attach something. But right now it is software and could be easily be stolen. And lastly, on the semiconductor, when the semiconductor chips, if it is doubtful, it is being built into anything for Apple Watch, for the CCTV cameras, and everything is connected to the network. And what is scary about the network world is you don't have the sense of time, no sense of distance. So if you would like to attack your enemy, you don't need a big status, the weapon. Just click the button. About 13 years old, they're trained as soldiers. And in North Korea, it is only several thousands of yen, the type of the wage given, and those, the children, are now able to make the attack. So the network, semiconductor, everything needs to be cleaned up. If not, then we will be beaten by the other side. That is what the U.S. government is claiming. That is exactly what is happening. And then what about the other edge? The paper and pencil, and also quantum computer. You cannot really welcome the Chinese students because those with a PLA may disguise themselves as students. Now in Japan as well, screening is much stricter. And DOE last year, because it is a free country, if you would like to have research together with China, that's fine. But if you're given money from China, U.S. government will no longer be commissioned. But a professor at Harvard has lied, and now he has been arrested as fraud. So it is getting stricter and stricter. So you can focus and narrow down on those fine things. And with the COVID-19, the China has been recovering, and a lot of investments are now made from the United States. Nobody grumbles about this. Just to do with the national security, that is very sensitive. Now, with Mr. Trump, I was really frightened and observing the situation. When the government changes, then it is just like the musical, the band. Everything must be aligned with the music it being played.
It so happens that today, at Liberal Democratic Party, New Order Creation headquarters economic section meeting was held. And the first meeting under the current administration was held today. What was just mentioned are the types of topics that were discussed at this meeting. The war frontline is extending into different worlds, including cyber, and that is quite true. I will try to avoid duplication, and I hope to touch upon this from my vantage point. The Cold War was the Cold War between the U.S. and USSR after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think it was Jeffrey Garten who said this, but for some time, the U.S. Department of Commerce senior official said there's cold peace. Even though it's peaceful, it's still awkward. And what was interesting to me recently is, as Mr. Kanehara mentioned, economic relations are continuing. And it's not going to be a war like what we had in the Pacific War. So uneasy peace is the terminology used by Chinese in the United States or even Americans in the United States. And for example, gene editing, Casper-9, for that research, Nobel was awarded the other day. This cannot be used on human beings. In the West, at least, that is the common understanding that it should not be used in human beings. But in China already, there are babies with this technology. I think the babies are now, by now, should be about 2 or 3 years old, and the data can be collected. There is an ethical problem, but before overcoming ethical problem, these technologies are actually applied. And in Shenzhen, there are autonomous driving cars in large numbers. I'm afraid of traffic accidents, but they are driven at 50 kilometers per hour every day, and data is gathered every day. So level 4, in order to realize level 4 for autonomous driving, data is being collected. And be it privacy, credit scoring, and payment data, if necessary, if Chinese government demands such data, the data will be provided readily. So things are becoming more efficient, but what we consider to be important, such as human rights and privacy and ethics, are belittled, perhaps. That is the situation that is called uneasy peace. In the United States, up until Obama administration, because of greater affluence and as a GDP per capita gap is reduced, I think many people hope that China will become similar to countries like the United States. And famous Pillsbury, a China hand, under Trump administration said that they were wrong in the book 100-Year Marathon. And he's said to have drafted the speech by Vice President Pence. Those China hands in the United States had changed their thinking vis-a-vis China. And in China, including some very senior party leaders, are thinking that perhaps initiatives under President Xi may have been too outright. If keeping low profile was continued for more time, then it may have been easier to overtake the United States. But initiatives were taken perhaps too prematurely by President Xi, according to some party elders. So I think there are more people who question the dominance by President Xi. So, there is some reflection and change of thinking in the United States and in China as well. That being the case, and if there is the second term of Trump administration, although there will not be a complete agreement, negotiations may continue, and in various cases, compromises will be sought. In case of Biden administration, I mentioned in my initial remarks, there may be something that is not preferred by China, but to be more specific, something that will not be unwelcome by President Xi may be considered by Biden administration. Even President Xi, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have any rival in China. So U.S. policy could be deployed in a way to benefit the competitors of President Xi. If there is a direct boxing match between China and U.S. in the fashion of President Trump, that will be more advantageous to China. But on the ring, it's not U.S. and China, but it will be President Xi and his competitors. And from outside of the ring, U.S. will support those forces competing against President Xi. And that will be more difficult to manage for President Xi. And that may be the thinking that might emerge in Biden administration. That is my personal view.
今の
Now, we have just heard from the two panelists. Both were quite interesting. The question was about US-China relations and also economic security. So in English, economic statecraft is more of a term, be it a foreign policy or national security, to be related to economy. So what you have suggested is this should be primarily the case. But these days, the significance have been changing. That is because of rise of China in mind. What Japan needs to be careful of is how U.S. will respond to China and what may be China reacting to the United States. We need to scrutinize both how the U.S. and China may be moving forward. If not, we will be mistaken. It is something very difficult for us to understand. What I have learned when I was studying in the United States is you should be the first one to ask question. If you ask the question, then your question will be dealt with mostly. That is true for U.S. and China. Then how can the U.S. deal with the China and in terms of technology and in terms of security matters? Japan should discuss with the United States, and we should also make suggestions and also listen to their view as well. And also do the same thing for China, not to have unnecessary bloodshed to happen. And if you make a mistake and try to prevent any critical technology to be taken over by China, that needs to be done. And as Mr. Honorable Hayashi has suggested, LDP is thinking about this. That's fine. Another important matter would be this kind of thinking was missing in Japan. And this kind of thinking needs to be promoted, and you have to have brain exercise. You have to go on a trial and error basis. The important thing is U.S.-China trade friction and decoupling are being confused as one. What Mr. Kanehara said was quite well sorted out. So once again, U.S. and China economy to be decoupled completely. That is not being aimed for. It is not like USSR in the past. Economic activity and trade must be continued because of COVID-19 especially, even with the next administration, economic recovery matters a lot. If you exclude all the Chinese products, U.S. will also be in difficulty. So you have to be selective and to think about the future as well. That is the way to go in terms of thinking. As the television documentary was speaking about, in China, the flags for supporting Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump are actually being produced in China. And that's fine, because Chinese market is also important to us. So we should be friendly with China when it comes to trade and commerce. That's fine. But we need to be selective. It is not just having good communication with the United States. For survival of Japan, we need to work out our own way to deal with both the U.S. and China. Pillsbury was mentioned by Honorable Hayashi. When you look back into history, it was 1972. That was a turning point in U.S.-China relations. Under President Nixon, United States were confronting both China and USSR. Now they were trying to bring in China closer to U.S. And those who were thinking about the different policies, Pillsbury was a young researcher at Land Corporation, and he came up with a memo. And for USSR and the NATO, the West, the military balance, we were inferior to the Eastern camp. So with China brought in, the USSR would be in inferior position. And it was Dr. Pillsbury who have come up with this article. But we were wrong. And he stated openly that he was wrong. And that is great. So this is something good about the Americans. But the environment changed. The ambience has changed. We need to have a similar brain exercise in Japan as well.
Thank you. In the morning Yomiuri edition, there was a report that Chinese government vessels incursion was up to 60 hours only for this week in Japanese territorial waters. The incursion by Chinese government vessels lasted close to 60 hours. And there are Quad advocating FOIP, and the ministerial conference was held in Japan. And it is clearly seen as a retaliation from China for that Quad meeting in Japan. Security environment in Japan and East Asia will be affected by the attitude of China. What will be the likely behavior of China? And FYP, will it take off, not remaining just as a vision? When we look at Senkaku only, we cannot understand the total picture. We have to look at the entirety, including East China Sea and South China Sea. China has a military for communications, and it's also done by the United States. It's the exception in Japan. Pantomime by military is used by many countries. China is taking expansionary maritime strategy. I think this is mistaken. In 1982, a Chinese person said 300 square kilometers. This means that East China Sea, Bohai Sea, these seas are included. And brown water navy is only 30 nautical miles, but stronger navies will have to be able to navigate in a greater distance in the ocean. Chinese PLA navy was weak. So I think the Chinese officials said that it should become stronger, 300 square kilometers, but that comes from the mindset of weak PLA navy. It should be a narrow scope if a navy is truly strong. But China still takes this attitude. And it's not just Japan. There is a ferry cross in Mischief in South China Sea, and there is a 3,000-meter strip for landing of the fighter planes. And President Xi was forced to say that China will not militarize these structures in South China Sea, but they are military. And in Natuna Sea, near Indonesia, there is a Natuna Island. And Indonesia was thinking that it was free of incursion from China, but fishing vessels, Chinese fishing vessels entered, and they had to be repelled. And in the south of Vietnam, there is oil drilling by Vietnam and Russia jointly, but China is now entering into that area as well. And they use sea coast. Senkaku is subject to US-Japan alliance, and if a navy is involved, the article under US-Japan alliance will be invoked. So China clearly avoids sending naval ships, but it uses naval police and exercises de facto force. And this is not in Japan, but in the rest of Asian seas as well. So it has fundamentally changed to take expansionary policy in the seas. Also in the mountains as well, but in the seas. And it seems as if it has gone beyond the red line. We have to continue to pay close attention. And NATO is a land alliance. So it's like having a scrum. But in Asia, there are many islands, and it's a hub and spoke, and it's spread across. And there is only one that unites the US-Japan alliance. But will the Philippines and Vietnam fight together? I don't think they are strongly interested in fighting together. And their forces are also smaller. But can US and Japan take care of everything? That is not possible. And with Korea, unfortunately, the relations have soured, and we can speak with the diplomatic officials, but not with the government per se very well. But Japan cannot single-handedly address the matter here, and we have to therefore use alliance, including with Australia and Indonesia, and Vietnam, and the Philippines, and Thailand, and Myanmar. For various reasons, they cannot confront China strongly, but we have to gather them in the same camp. This has to be considered seriously, and the U.S. is very large, so from their perspective, China is far away, and their reaction tend to come somewhat belatedly. Under the Koizumi administration, this was pointed out, but it was still not very well understood by the U.S. But all of a sudden, the U.S. has become very upset with China, and Japan is, well, that is what we were saying all along. But U.S. is so large, so if they come at full speed, it's going to be a huge collision. But we have to inform the U.S. of what is happening in East Asia. There are so few East Asian experts. So we have to provide information from our side, provide some guidance on the situation in East Asia.
Mr. Kanehara has sorted out the issue very well. Now, I don't remember when it was, but there was election in Taiwan, and I was in Beijing. I thought that it is very difficult to understand. Now, if you do experience election, myself, when Taiwan is having election, and when Chinese mainland vessels come closer to Taiwan, saying that they are just in exercise, and I don't think the voters in Taiwan would succumb to that. It will actually be the reverse. The nationalism will actually be further boosted in Taiwan. So maybe China, because they have never experienced the free election, they don't really understand. So the individuals do not have the freedom to voice their views. So I don't think they really understood. But when I look back, maybe the Chinese did understand, but domestically, maybe they were making a pantomime, behaving to the domestic audience, perhaps. So they are maybe more inward-looking when they take certain behavior. So Japan and China should have a good communication channel so that we can always continue to have a dialogue. And that is important for us. So in that sense, the Suga administration should continue our existing policy vis-à-vis China, and I'm expecting that to happen. Now, talking about Mr. Trump underestimates and undervalues alliance, it is often said. When Mr. Trump is re-elected, what would be his next goal after being re-elected? So 4 years, he would not have to undergo any election. So what would be the policies and stance for the Trump second term? We need to be carefully making analysis. And who would be the secretaries of state and defense, including the incumbent secretary to be continued? We should look at which people he will be choosing. That would be important for us as well.
Free and open Indo-Pacific. The first idea came from the former Prime Minister Abe. It came from initially Japan, but fortunately that is also shared by the United States. But of course, these are two different countries with two different levels of powers and two different geographic locations. So the word may mean somewhat differently, but there are many things that can be commonly understood. Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Australia, India, these are important countries for both the U.S. and Japan. And in the end, I think there is something that even China can agree to. China has become very affluent because although it may not be a democracy, the rule of law is accepted. Without rule of law, business cannot be carried out. and stable environment is important. If there is war or terrorism, business cannot be conducted. China became richer because of this, and repeatedly we have to point this out to Chinese. The United States and Japan, if that is pointed out unilaterally, and in Southeast Asia, well, Japan does not want to be caught in the middle of the U.S. and China, but that is a role. There is an area where a role must be played by Japan, not the United States, and India and Australia. And this is quite difficult to discuss, but President Trump oftentimes speak in very blunt terms. And he is like a bully, to be frank. But what Mr. Abe did very well is that he recognized that there is a good thinking behind that bullying surface, and turned Mr. Trump's focus on the situation in East Asia. The former National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, said that when Mr. Abe resigned, Prime Minister Abe turned Mr. Trump into more pragmatic vision using sort of a magic, according to Mr. Bolton. And this is what Japan should continue to do. Be it the re-election of Mr. Trump or new President Biden, we have to discuss the reality with the United States and what is beneficial, positive for Japan, the United States, and Asian countries. A free, open Indo-Pacific is a very good way to set an agenda where it's easier to get everyone to agree on. The think tank's role is to set the agenda, and the implementation has to come from the government and the politicians. So we now have a good agenda set, free and open in the Pacific. The rest is the implementation.
Honorable Hayashi had mentioned that Mr. Trump ignored alliance in his first term. But then, with the Biden administration being born, could there be different bilateral relationship? The host, the nation support, there could be some changes there. What about TPP? You mentioned at the outset. Do you think that the U.S. may return to TPP? What may be the probability of that? I would like to ask all the panelists. So, Mr. Hayashi first. We are still in the midst of the presidential election. But what has been said during the campaign would be to try to make a difference with the other camp. Mr. Biden is saying that he would place more emphasis on alliances. And Mr. Trump has been always saying he was outside of the Washington circle, but Mr. Biden has been within the Washington circle for 3 decades. So the market analysis and how you regard that is now inculcated into his body, so to speak. So I don't think Mr. Biden would be much like Mr. Trump saying something casually. He would have the more well thought out policies and statements, and that would be more in the national interest of the United States. He has been responsible for foreign policy within the Congress for many decades, and he has been a vice president under the Obama administration. So that is something we can expect if Mr. Biden wins in the election. Now, during the Obama administration, many people in the government that could return, and within the Congress, the elders, just like the Reagan administration, perhaps the secretaries of state and defense would be somebody of a very heavy weight. Now, about TPP, I have given a wishful thinking, so to speak, at the outset. The TPP, United States has joined the P4 to start with. And this was a tool against the China. So logically speaking, Mr. Biden could think that this would be beneficial for the U.S. to rejoin. And within the Democrats, having said so, you do have a congressman who has been elected by the trade union. So there is a difficulty there. President Obama, when I was the Agricultural Ministry, I was working with the USTR, and when TPP is not being agreed upon, they felt very uncomfortable. You have to work ardently and strenuously with the Congress in order to have the agreement to be ratified. But the Republicans they could change over and support the CPTPP after the midterm election. But this time, the election, this time, maybe the people who are much closer to the Trump the camp could be elected, re-elected. But I do not really think there could be more friends for the TPP, perhaps. But in terms of TPP, what the U.S. and Japan are doing right now on trade agreement could be translated into CPTPP, and that may be more feasible, perhaps. Because U.S. has withdrawn the ones, and in terms of framework, there has been something different been ongoing. I don't think it is that easy for United States to come back. So Japan-U.S. Trade agreements could be utilized in that respect in trying to work with the Congress, and that may be more possible and feasible and workable in the future.
Regarding host nation support, well, the ally, how much cost sharing should there be for basing of U.S. troops by the ally? And NATO members has set defense spending as 2% of the GDP, and I think these two go hand in hand. It's not just President Trump, but 2% was started even under Obama administration. The allies should make more effort. That is the, I think, the sense of the United States, generally speaking, be it the President Trump's re-election or President Biden. I think the pressure will come from the U.S. nonetheless to increase host nation support. And I think that is generally supported by the Americans. So Japan should ready itself to have that negotiation. In case of Mr. Trump, he's very particular about the financial amount as well. He uses his experience from business. So he calculates profits and losses, and the U.S. spent so much money and such. And so we have to think carefully, but Japan also doesn't have much budget, but then how the money will be used? About 80% of the basing cost of the U.S. Is supported by Japan already, so Japan should be more creative. We should also think about bringing into discussion what Japan can do more in terms of defense. An example is cybersecurity. The budget for cybersecurity in Japan is very small in comparison to other countries. So perhaps an idea is to spend more on cybersecurity, and new digital agency will be created. This is major policy under Suga administration. It is said that digital agency will not handle cybersecurity per se so much, but can we have weak cybersecurity when digital is promoted by digital agency? The answer is there should be adequate care of cybersecurity. So we have to think outside of the conventional wisdom. The world has changed. We have to think more creatively. We shouldn't just take a passive attitude or try to evade in the negotiations, but we should think more creatively in host nation support as well, linking that to Japan's defense spending.
4 points very briefly. When Mr. Biden wins in the election, a wishful thinking pass, but if may think about such, Biden and Trump, there are decisive difference in terms of alliance relationship. For Mr. Trump, alliances are the burden, that it is nuisance, it is too costly. That is the position of Mr. Trump. On the other hand, Mr. Biden is more of a traditional diplomatic community surrounding him. So alliance is an asset. So or the worldwide alliance would be very important asset for the United States. So burden or asset, that's a big difference. Now about their stance vis-a-vis China, I don't think that would change even under Mr. Biden. Mr. Trump, 200,000 deaths because of COVID-19. Only 20,000 when we had the great the Eastern Japan earthquake. So if Mr. Trump is that asks that this is a failure of policy, he would have to lose in the election. But Mr. Biden wins, you can really blame Mr. Trump for the COVID-19 policies. But having said so, I don't think Mr. Biden would soften its stance vis-a-vis China. Geopolitical-wise, they would have to continue to be strict, more anti-Chinese and the more pro-Chinese. Both would join the political camp. But I would say that it would be very difficult to be translated into English. You need to bend, but not too flexibly. About 80 trillion and 20 trillion for China. It would increase to 30 trillion or so. So I don't think nothing happens. Whether the alliance is an asset or burden, now Mr. Biden says it is asset, but when it comes to burden, he would just discard the alliance. So we need to be prepared for that. It is not like Mr. Trump saying that you have to increase by 5-fold, and that is impossible. But Japan and the government should make efforts to try to increase our military, the defense budget. For cyber, we are lagging too much behind. We need to do it more properly. Right now, because we use paper, they're too secure. But if it is more digitalized, cyber attack, because we are too behind in terms of digitalization, nobody attacks us cyber-wise. But if we digitalize more, because we are overwhelmingly trailing behind, we need to be serious in trying to have a cybersecurity. Well, teens are fine, but you have professionals in cyber attacks. So we need to be prepared, and we need to revamp our budget in this regard.
Thank you very much. We are almost running out of time. So as I promised to the audience initially, I would like to ask each panelist to make a prediction of who will win the U.S. presidential election. As of today, please write down your answer on the paper and put it up on the folder. First, Mr. Watanabe, Biden. Mr. Hayashi, Biden. Mr. Kanehara, Christmas gift. What do you mean by Christmas gift? Japanese Foreign Ministry rule is that we shouldn't answer who will become the next American president. And we should not tell what we want until the day of the Christmas. And when we receive a gift, we say, this is exactly what I wanted. So that is the rule in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Lastly, as a prerogative of a moderator, or to abuse my own power, Mr. Hayashi, what is being focused upon these days? So if I may dare to ask this question, now, would you be running for the next presidential election for the LDP? And perhaps for the House of Representatives rather than House of Councillors? So at the Yamaguchi, the 3rd district, how about that? This is something totally different from the American presidential election, but I myself, it has been reported very recently. And after this press report, I have actually made comments publicly. There is nothing more to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is now time to wrap up. Mr. Watanabe, Mr. Hayashi, and Mr. Kanehara, in that order, could you give a minute of closing remarks? I wrote down Biden, but this is, as of now, there is no telling what will happen in 2 weeks' time. And as Mr. Kanehara said, the rule in Foreign Ministry is that we shouldn't say something definitively until the last minute. With the senior officials of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we had a study meeting a few years ago, and I said Hillary Clinton has the lead. And the officer in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that we have seen many presidential elections, and until the end, we don't know what happens. And indeed, President Trump won, and I was relieved that Minister of Foreign Affairs had foresight. And anything can happen in the election. Prediction is a prediction, forecast is a forecast, but diplomats, government officials have to prepare for any outcome. I wrote down Biden, but it's not that he has absolute lead. As I explained, with a slight differences in the factors, outcome may change. But that is also true for everything in the world, including the US presidential election. I think people in Japan should seriously think about the foundation of life that we have, and in the post-Cold War era, what strategy we should have. I think it's good time to rethink these. There are certain hardships under President Trump's administration, but I think it was a good opportunity to encourage us to take an out-of-the-box thinking. And this panel discussion as well is a very good brain exercise, and thank you for that opportunity.
Now, there are two grandfathers fighting for the presidency in the United States. But in Japan, the leadership is getting younger and younger. Now, after the Heisei era, now in the Reiwa era, the younger people would be looking forward, and they would like to have more pride, and they would like to see more strategy from the government. And Prime Minister in my own generation would be Prime Minister Noda and Prime Minister Abe. It was good that I have been able to serve Prime Minister Abe for many, many years, and I hope that Prime Minister Suga would also exercise good leadership. It is no longer the age for us to listen to whatever the U.S. tells us to do. We should speak up ourselves. Then Asian countries would go through the same difficulty. Whether the Western soul to be siphoned out, is that fine? Oh, what about our own modernization? Do we really understand democracy? The Asian countries would think about that. We don't have to worry. The Asian countries are very diligent. They would industrialize, they will modernize, and they will become nation state, and ultimately they would become a democracy. This is only us that we can say that. And we should be bold enough to flag the way as champions like de Gaulle or Churchill. Those kind of statesmen and leaders, I'm sure, could be born going forward, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you very much. And with the two fellow panelists, I enjoyed this discussion very much. Strategy was mentioned by both of the panelists. The Western countries are the textbook, and Japan was trying to catch up to become a member of the West. And in its haste, there were some distortions, but now we have to exercise our brain and have to have a strategy ready ahead of times. I was made aware of this once again, reviewing the current situation in this discussion. So we should think outside of the box, and it's not just the thinking that we have to do. In my case, we have to implement the decisions. And when I was asked to forecast the future president, now I learned some good lessons. So in the future, when I ask the same question, I will say Christmas gift. And I would like to thank the panelists, fellow panelists.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank all the panelists and those who have listened to us for the long time. We have gone above board by 10 minutes or so, so we would like to end the forum for today. What we have discussed today will appear on the 19th of October, the next Monday, in our morning paper. And those who have been on the live stream, I hope that you can once again look at our Yomiuri Shimbun paper. The Yomiuri International Forum 2020 Autumn Session, Trump, Biden, and Japan Security Strategy is now over. Thank you very much once again for your attendance. Thank you.